They tried to fine my land into submission, but instead, they flooded their own president in a white SUV, smack in the middle of a clay basin my family's known about since the Reagan years. That was the beginning of the end, though technically it started 3 weeks earlier when Magnolia Prescott, queen of the clipboard brigade, declared war on my ranch in the name of community excellence. She didn't not. She parked like she owned the hill, marched up in heels that had never met cow dung, and told me, with full HOA confidence, that my native grass was hurting their award chances. I smiled, took a sip of coffee, and asked if her landscape designer had a flood plan. That part went right over her head. Not the last thing that would. Leave a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. If you're hooked on stories with real grit, sharp twists, poetic justice, and just the right dose of HOA drama, go ahead and smash that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale? Even juicier. And trust me, what's coming next? You're not going to want to miss it. She came bearing a binder thicker than a church casserole menu and laid it on my porch table like the 10 Commandments. Inside, lawn heights, color codes, acceptable furniture angles, and, God help us, a section titled Porch Neutrality. I've seen federal maps with fewer demands. "Mr. Lane," she said, "we're building something special here. You're part of that, whether you like it or not." I told her this ranch had been here 40 years, long before her HOA had a name, and it would be here long after their streetlights flickered out. That's when her smile froze. And when the clipboard came out, the real one, the one with fines starting at $50.00 and climbing like Texas heat. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I called my granddaughter Riley, who speaks fluent property law and sarcasm, and she said one word: plats. That night, while Jonas was fiddling with his drone and asking if he could film my erosion test from above, I was already back in the mindset I hadn't touched since teaching soil science at Hill County College. The part of me that knows water doesn't shout either. It waits, builds, finds its route, and delivers its truth when gravity's ready. I didn't plan revenge. I planned a lesson, and I let nature take the final exam. Within 7 days, Magnolia sent reinforcements. A man named Officer Decker, whose uniform screamed cop cosplay and whose badge looked printed from a laminate app, began parking at the edge of my land every morning at 7:30, said he was conducting ongoing compliance surveillance. I waved, offered him water. He declined, polite, firm, and clueless. Meanwhile, Jonas started timing him. Day 3, Grandpappy's, is like a screensaver with binoculars. Riley started digging into HOA boundary filings and found cracks wider than the dry creek bed behind the barn. But I didn't need law to beat them. I had something older: topography, rainfall records, and time. Because here's the thing, Decker had no idea he was parking in a natural runoff basin, the same depression noted in my 1991 survey. Magnolia had no clue her Dream Award campaign was about to be drenched in irony. And I just kept sipping my coffee, watching clouds build on the horizon, like old friends showing up late but right on time. The first time I saw Officer Brant Decker, he was standing beside a white sedan like he'd just parked justice itself. Aviators, black vest, clipboard the size of a menu at a bad steakhouse. The patch on his arm said HOA Security Specialist, which sounds official until you realize it's not. No badge, no license, just attitude and polyester. He said he was there to perform a compliance perimeter assessment, which is a fancy way of saying, I'm going to stand here and pretend I matter. According to Decker, the HOA had extended its boundaries, and my ranch had apparently drifted inside their imaginary jurisdiction like a misbehaving goat. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I'd seen enough kids bluff at poker night to know when the deck is fake and the dealer's sweating. Decker had no clue he was parked in a historical flood channel. I did. That was the difference. He returned the next morning, and the next, always 7:30 sharp, like HOA obedience had a punch card. He'd set up a camera, jot notes in his little book, and take photos of my pasture like he expected the grass to confess. I offered him water once. He declined. Maybe he thought kindness was a violation. Either way, he parked in the exact same spot every day, never shifted, never strayed. Dead center in a shallow depression I'd logged during a 1998 hydrology survey. That spot had seen more floodwater than a culvert in hurricane season, but thanks to the drought, it looked harmless. That's how Texas does pay back. Quiet, then biblical. And Decker, bless him, was making it real easy to measure consequences. Riley called that Thursday. "Grandpa, I pulled up the plat records," she said. "The HOA submitted a boundary expansion 3 years ago, but it was never approved by the county." I grinned. "So they just drew new lines and hoped nobody noticed?" "Pretty much," she said. "They're bluffing, and they're bluffing bad." That same evening, Decker flew his drone overhead, filming Decker's car from every angle like it was a wildlife documentary. He added commentary, too. Day 5, the suburban predator circles his prey. So far, 0 compliance violations. Grass remains unmoved. It was the first time I'd seen HOA harassment turned into a 6th-grade science project, and let me tell you, it felt righteous. But what made it even better? Decker's confidence. He strutted up and down that road like he was guarding Fort Knox. Meanwhile, Magnolia kept her distance, probably thinking her human scarecrow was enough to keep me in check. But if she knew anything about me or the land, she'd know pressure doesn't scare old bedrock. It just makes it more precise. Every day Decker parked. I added notes to my own field journal, soil moisture, dew patterns, subtle dips in the terrain. If he thought I was being monitored, he had no idea how closely I was watching him back. My ranch has taught 3 generations how to read the land. Decker hadn't even figured out he was parking in its mouth. By Sunday, even the cows were used to the show. They'd graze nearby, occasionally glance at the man in the vest, then go back to chewing like, "This guy again?" Jonas started naming the operation, Project Puddle Watch. I suggested Stuck Patrol. Meanwhile, Riley was emailing me screenshots of legal precedents, cases where HOAs overreached and lost. She underlined the ones where the judge used the phrase abuse of authority. It was starting to feel like we weren't just fighting to be left alone. We were documenting stupidity for sport, and honestly, I've never felt more prepared to teach a lesson. One afternoon, Decker caught me measuring ground elevation with my old Transit. "What's all this for?" he asked, squinting like he understood topography. I smiled. "Just prepping for a science project with my grandson," I said. "Got a storm moving in this week. Good time to study how water finds its way." He nodded slowly, clearly confused, then wrote something in his notepad like I'd just confessed to planning erosion. That's the moment I knew we had him. See, when you poke nature long enough, it answers with gravity. Decker was about to learn that the hard way, and I was more than happy to let the weather do the talking. But the real power move? Patience. I didn't file complaints, didn't call the sheriff. I just waited, like a canyon waits for the river to remember its path. Magnolia had built her authority on cosmetics, matching fences, painted mailboxes, and pre-approved welcome mats. But land doesn't follow HOA guidelines. It remembers, and I was sitting on 30 years of that memory. As Decker kept showing up, all I could think was, "You're standing on proof you don't even see." A compliance officer with no credentials, parked on a fault line of ignorance and wet clay. It was poetic. It was inevitable. And it was nearly time. That night, Jonas came into the kitchen holding a plastic container full of sand and gravel. "Grandpa, look, I made a flood model. You pour water here and it runs into the dip, just like the driveway." He poured a cup and we watched the water collect around a toy car in the basin. "See?" he said, beaming. "It gets stuck." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "Kiddo," I said, "you just built the HOA's future." He grinned. "Should I name it?" "Sure," I said. "Call it, Don't Park Where You Don't Belong." The next morning I watched Decker park in the same spot again, same time, same routine. Only now the clouds were building, the forecast was whispering, and I could feel the ground remembering how to speak. So hang on tight, because next is when the land writes its own version of the HOA rulebook with water. The trick isn't to outshout a bully, it's to outlast them. That's what I told Jonas when we started marking the land together. While Decker kept clicking away with his camera like he was auditioning for America's Next Top Lawn Violation, we pulled out my old geological survey maps and got to work. We logged slope angles, checked soil density, measured contour shifts, things I hadn't touched since I left the classroom but never stopped using here at home. Jonas took it seriously too. "We're prepping for something," he whispered, as if the land were eavesdropping. "We are," I said. "A demonstration. One nature's been planning since long before Magnolia had a clipboard. Because, here's the quiet truth, you don't have to scream when you're standing where gravity does the speaking." Jonas built his first flood model out of a baking tray, a few rocks, and a plastic horse from one of his old toys. "This is Decker's car," he said, pointing at the horse. I raised an eyebrow. "He drives a sedan, kid," Jonas shrugged. "Same level of awareness." He poured water through a funnel, and it pooled, like clockwork, right in the tray's middle dip. "Now imagine that with 2 inches of rain," he said, "or 3. I smiled. He wasn't just playing anymore, he was preparing. It reminded me of my old field days when we teach students how land doesn't argue with people, it just remembers. I realized then that Jonas wasn't just learning science, he was learning strategy. And the HOA didn't have a defense plan for a 12-year-old with field notes. Around that time, Mrs. Butterfield from 2 lots over brought over lemon bars and news. "Magnolia's got big dreams," she said, leaning in like she was trading stock tips. "Apparently she's applying for some statewide community leadership award, telling everyone it'll boost property values by 20%. Then she winked. "And apparently your place is the only one messing up the pictures." I laughed, but the implication was clear. Magnolia wasn't just enforcing rules, she was staging a campaign. And I was the hay bale on her runway. More neighbors dropped by over the next few days, some with cookies, others with side-eye sympathy. Each one told a piece of the same story. Magnolia was turning Pristine Crest into a showroom, and anything wild, natural, or old enough to have a story didn't make the cut. But the weather didn't read newsletters, and it was about to vote. The rain forecast rolled in like a prophecy. 2 storms, possibly merging, heading straight for our corner of the county. Local radio called it a hydration event. I called it an invitation. Jonas and I checked our data one last time, marking Decker's daily parking zone on a transparent overlay of my hydrology map. Right in the heart of a historical basin, one I'd documented back in '98 during a particularly nasty spring runoff. "You think it'll really flood?" he asked. "Flood is a strong word," I said. "Let's just say the ground remembers how to hold a grudge." The science was solid, the conditions ideal. I wasn't hoping for damage, I was hoping for clarity. Because sometimes the best way to win an argument is to let water do the talking. I didn't warn Decker. That would have spoiled the lesson. He parked like usual, right on the X-marked basin, adjusting his mirrors like that made him invincible. Jonas filmed it all from the porch, labeling his footage, "Subject returns to sacred puddle zone." We didn't need confrontation. We had elevation charts, barometric pressure, and the patience of limestone. The silence was intentional. Because when you've got 30 years of weather memory under your boots and a 12-year-old with a drone in your corner, you don't shout. You just wait. And trust me, the waiting was almost over. What came next wouldn't just be wet. It would be unforgettable. You ever see karma roll in on 4 wheels, wearing a vest and carrying a clipboard? I have. It came during what the meteorologists called a 100-year storm. Funny, I didn't need a weatherman to tell me that, I just watched the cows head uphill. When livestock starts seeking elevation, it's not superstition, it's a system check. By midnight, The sky opened up like it had a vendetta. Rain hammered the metal roof, ran in rivers off the porch, and poured down every channel I'd marked on my survey maps. Gravity doesn't care about homeowners' associations, it just follows the truth. And that truth had one thing to say: everything finds its level. By dawn, the ground looked like it had been carved new overnight. Gullies ran deeper, ditches turned to creeks, and right out front, exactly where Decker had been parking, stood a brand new Texas-sized puddle, big enough to host baptisms. But right on cue, 7:30 rolled around, and so did Officer Brent Decker, punctual to a fault and blind to consequence. He pulled up, nose of his sedan dipping into that soft basin like a ship easing into harbor. I stood on the porch, cup of coffee in hand, and watched the tires sink ever so politely. He didn't even flinch, just grabbed his clipboard like it was a badge and stepped out into 3 inches of muddy education. You ever seen someone try to look in charge while slowly losing elevation? It's a beautiful thing. Jonas was ready. That kid had his drone charged, camera rolling, and commentary loaded. Subject has returned to the basin, he narrated, hovering the drone just above the splash zone. Unexpected rainfall has reactivated historic runoff. Officer appears unaware. From my porch, I could see Decker setting up his tripod again, boots now sloshing in ankle-deep soup. His camera wobbled. He slipped once, then again. It's hard to take notes when the ground is trying to swallow your shoes. Meanwhile, I watched little rivulets pour off the slope behind him, feeding the basin like it was a welcome home party for old water. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't revenge. It was science. And sometimes, science gets dramatic. And then came the crown jewel of the morning, Magnolia Prescott. Her white SUV appeared like a ghost through the mist, creeping up the road as if decency might still be salvaged. But what she found was Decker, soaked, sputtering, and up to his calves in what HOA paperwork would probably call unauthorized landscaping. Magnolia stepped out with that signature style, powder blue pantsuit, pearl necklace, clipboard held like a holy relic. She made it 2 steps before the water welcomed her. I watched her face as her boot disappeared in the mud, and her smile dissolved into something between outrage and denial. You ever see dignity drowned in real time? It's quiet, but it splashes. By this point, neighbors had come out with lawn chairs, coffee mugs, and camera phones. Mrs. Butterfield from 2 lots down was streaming live. Mr. Singh had popcorn. It was like county fair meets small-town courtroom drama. Magnolia tried to bark orders at Decker, who was busy trying to yank his clipboard out of the mud like Excalibur. "Document everything," she snapped. "We'll file formal citations." But the wind caught her binder, flung a few pages into the flood zone, and one of them floated right to my boots. HOA Violation Form 13B, Unauthorized Vegetation Density. I handed it back with a smile and said, "Seems like we've got more density than we bargained for." Now, I'd love to tell you Magnolia packed up and left right then, but no, she doubled down. She marched to the edge of the basin, pointing at my native grass like it personally offended her. This unmanaged chaos is exactly why Pristine Crest will never achieve model status, she snapped. And right then, as if nature itself were tired of her tone, a small wave lapped over her boots and soaked the hem of her suit. She froze, and in that moment, standing in water, covered in mud, she looked less like a president and more like a very determined woman losing a battle with topography. The HOA had rules. The land had memory. Guess who won? Jonas zoomed his drone in and caught it all. The boots, the binder, the bewildered HOA president pointing at grass while her clipboard floated away like a forgotten idea. The footage was gold. By noon, it had already made its way into the neighborhood Facebook group. The title? Floodplain Justice, a Cautionary Tale. Neighbors cheered. Some added music. One guy even looped Magnolia's rant with a banjo track. The HOA's iron grip had just slipped in the mud, and the whole block saw it happen in real time. I didn't have to lift a finger. I just let the rain speak. After the crowd dispersed, Magnolia stormed off, boots squelching, dignity dripping. Decker followed, soaked and speechless. The puddle remained, a natural monument to the power of patience and elevation charts. That night, I sat on the porch with Jonas and Riley, sipping tea and reviewing drone footage frame by frame. "Grandpa," Jonas said, pausing the video, "this is better than TV." And he was right, because some stories don't need scripts. They just need a little rain, the right elevation, and an HOA that thinks it can outvote nature. But don't go anywhere, because while the water made its point, the county was just getting started. And trust me, they brought clipboards of their own. By the time the tow truck hauled Decker's car out of my newly resurrected wetland, the story had grown legs. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it had turned into a minor civic event. Turns out, when a so-called HOA officer sinks his wheels into a documented flood basin while issuing citations about lawn length, the county takes an interest. That Monday, a caravan of real authority came crawling up the road. One marked county vehicle, a silver sedan with government plates, and a news van with a logo that made Magnolia flinch so hard I thought her pearls might snap. The people stepping out weren't here to enforce fine schedules. They were here to ask questions. And they carried their own clipboards, only these had actual weight behind them. I stayed on the porch. I always do when storms pass, let the ground dry before walking into what's next. The county engineer was a woman named Carrie Ponytail, steel-toed boots, and the eyes of someone who'd seen enough concrete try to control nature. She introduced herself politely, then asked if I was Emery Lane. "That's me," I said, motioning toward the field where puddles still shimmered like mirrors. "I think you'll find some of your jurisdiction floating out there near the cedar trees." She smiled. "I read your name in the initial report, something about long-term hydrological observation." I handed her a file. "A copy of my survey notes dating back to 1991, including flood pattern sketches, runoff velocity logs, and 2 photos of a much younger me ankle-deep in that same basin." Her eyes widened like she'd just found gold in a thrift store. "This is more comprehensive than half the consultants we hire." That's when Magnolia stepped out of her SUV, holding what I later learned was her last hope, a freshly printed emergency HOA resolution authorizing extended surveillance privileges. She stormed over, waving that paper like a wand, declaring that the HOA had been within its rights to monitor disruptive properties, and that any environmental impact from recent flooding was the result of unmanaged landscaping choices. It was like watching someone try to file a noise complaint against a thunderstorm. Carrie didn't even blink. "Mrs. Prescott, do you have drainage permits for the development upstream from this basin?" Magnolia hesitated, just for a beat. But it was long enough for the reporter from Channel 4 to lean in and press record. "Can you clarify whether the HOA coordinated with County Environmental Services during your neighborhood beautification efforts?" he asked. Magnolia glanced at the camera, then at Carrie, then at me. I smiled, sipped my coffee, and let the silence do what it does best: reveal the truth. The problem with trying to outpaper someone like me is that I've been documenting this land since before half of Magnolia's board members were born. I didn't do it for politics. I did it because the earth remembers things we forget. Where water goes, where it lingers, where it returns when ignored. So when Carrie unrolled her topographic overlay and laid it on my porch table, my annotations lined up almost perfectly with her agency's digital records. That's when it happened. That quiet shift in the air, the moment power changes hands, not with shouting, but with evidence. "Mr. Lane," Carrie said, "you wouldn't happen to have notes on sediment displacement after events like this, would you?" "Got 3 binders inside," I said, "filed by rainfall intensity." She nodded slowly. Magnolia turned to say something, but the reporter cut her off. "How long has your HOA been aware of the basin under this road?" It was a small question with a very large echo. Turns out Pristine Crest had paved right over a known runoff route without consulting the county or filing any hydrological reviews. And while they'd been busy enforcing lawn hues and mailbox designs, they'd ignored basic flood compliance. Carrie made a note, then asked to walk the property. I led her through the basin, pointing out native plant root structures that slowed erosion, areas where runoff naturally pooled, and where I'd encouraged water retention to protect downhill neighbors. The more I showed her, the more her clipboard filled up. Meanwhile, Magnolia stood back, watching her legacy dissolve in the same clay she'd tried to fine me for not mowing. The reporter followed us, filming everything. At one point he whispered to me, "You ever think you'd be the expert witness in a drainage scandal?" I laughed. I thought I was retired. We ended the tour at the back of the property, under a pecan tree that's been older than every resolution Magnolia ever dreamed up. Carrie turned and said, "Emery, what you've done here, it's a model, not just of resistance, but of land stewardship." That word stewardship hit harder than any county letter ever could. She asked if I'd be willing to speak at an upcoming county forum about sustainable development. "You mean tell the story of how a clipboard lost to a floodplain?" I asked. "Exactly," she said. As she left, Magnolia lingered, holding her soggy resolution like a magic spell that never cast. She gave me one last look, something between accusation and regret, but I didn't return it. I was too busy watching Jonas upload drone footage labeled "The Day the Water Voted Back." But you'll want to stick around, because this story, it's just now starting to ripple. 3 weeks after the flood, I got a visit from the county. Not the kind with fines or forms, but the kind that walks up your steps with a handshake and a folder embossed in gold. They handed me a certificate. Official seal, big words, fancy font. "This property is now recognized as the county's first natural resilience zone," it said. I chuckled. All these years I thought I was just planting native grass and letting the land breathe. Turns out I was running an environmental demonstration. The best part? No application required. Just a little patience, a lot of mud, and one very memorable compliance officer who learned the hard way what runoff really means. The papers framed now, hung right next to my old hydrology maps from the 90s. Legacy doesn't always come in bronze statues. Sometimes it shows up in laminated cardstock and boots that stayed dry. Meanwhile, Magnolia Prescott, former queen of the cul-de-sac, had herself a reckoning. At the next HOA meeting, neighbors showed up like they were attending a town hall crossed with a talent show. Folding chairs filled. Tempers simmered. Then the testimonials began. One homeowner stood up and said, "I moved here for peace, not paranoia." Another followed with, "My rose bushes don't need oversight." Someone in the back yelled, "Let the man keep his cows." By the end of the evening, the board held a vote. Majority ruled, Magnolia was out. No parade, no closing speech, just a woman who lost her crown to a puddle and a camera. She packed up within a month, house listed quietly, car loaded before sunrise. No goodbyes, just the hollow thud of HOA rules dissolving like sugar in rainwater. And honestly, the neighborhood's been breathing easier ever since. But the story doesn't end with mud and resignation. It circles back, as nature always does. Brent Decker, the self-appointed guardian of curb appeal, reappeared one Saturday. Minus the uniform, minus the clipboard, just jeans, a t-shirt, and a hesitant wave from the passenger seat of his cousin's truck. I figured he came to apologize, or at least explain why he'd spent 3 weeks parked in a puddle, acting like he was defending the Alamo. Instead, he said, "Mr. Lane, I enrolled in night school. Environmental science. I figured if the land's gonna humble me, I ought to learn its language." I smiled and handed him a worn paperback on watershed dynamics. "Start with Chapter 3, I said. That's where the mistakes get interesting." We shook hands. Funny thing, some fences don't need to be mended. They just need to be walked together. Jonas, meanwhile, had become a local legend. His drone video, when the HOA got schooled by a hill and a grandpa, exploded online. Last count, 2 million views. He got invited to a STEM youth conference. Riley helped him license the footage and set up an online store. Stickers, even mugs with Decker's sedan floating like a lost canoe. "This is ridiculous," Riley said with a grin as she signed a media release, "but it's also kind of brilliant." I watched Jonas narrate his video to a classroom over Zoom one afternoon. "See how the water pools here? That's called a depression basin. And this, right here, is a lesson in listening to your land before you legislate it. I could have cried, but I didn't. Just nodded like a man watching the next generation find their rhythm. Riley didn't stop at copyright. She filed for a conservation easement, locking our land into a protected status that shields it from rezoning, development, and any future HOA nonsense. "This place is now bulletproof," she said, signing the final page. "No one's paving your pasture, Grandpa." I raised a glass of sweet tea to that. For years I'd thought this land only mattered to me. But turns out, legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're still around to enjoy it. And this patch of dirt, soaked in stormwater and stubborn roots, had become something more than a ranch. It had become a quiet example of what happens when you work with nature instead of trying to wallpaper over it with neighborhood codes and fake authority. These days, I sit on my porch and watch the grass grow exactly how it's supposed to, without permission slips. The cows graze, the sky rolls in with its moods. And sometimes, when it rains, I still see that puddle form where Decker once parked with such confidence. It's smaller now, but it lingers. A little muddy monument to what happens when arrogance outruns understanding. And honestly, I'm grateful not for the chaos, not for the clipboard wars, but for the clarity that comes when water tells the truth louder than any man can. Because nature doesn't forget. And if you give it time, if you give it space, it'll show you how to win, without ever raising your voice. So if you're out there right now dealing with your own Magnolia, your own HOA drama, your own patch of dirt that someone else wants to manicure into mediocrity, here's what I'll tell you. Know your land. Document it. Defend it smart. Let patience be your protest, because the ground holds stories longer than signatures, and the truth, like water, always finds its level. And every now and then, it floods back just to remind folks who was here first.